Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on MIP data entry tips and tricks. Today we have Kathy Dwyer, a senior application consultant here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over all questions at the end. Thank you. I'll now hand it over to Kathy.
All righty. Thank you, Colleen, and good morning, all. Thank you, first of all, for taking time out of your busy day to attend. These webinars are Zobrio University's quick hits, so we'll get rolling right away and see, if you can take away a tip or trick or two. So what we're looking at right now is, of course, the MIP My Home page, which is the help and support page. Okay. What I thought we would start off with today is some of the stuff you guys probably know, but we'll do a quick review. Up here under Options, the first menu choice down there, Customize Workstation Settings. Okay, this is really a significant job that typically you set it, and it is on a workstation basis, so each person could have a different environment with your MIP. And typically what you do is you set the values in this screen, and it's very rare you really go back to it and maybe reset it. But rather than touching on every point in all 5 of the tabs that you see across the top, I'm going to touch on some of those that I think are a bit more significant. Now, for instance, we come in under the default tab for Preferences. And a couple of the fields that I like to tell people to check off is the very first one that says Save Form Layout. Okay, and what that basically means is if you're in a template where you're entering data, you're in a grid area, and geez, I wish it asked me this question before that question, or you wanted to resequence columns. By having this Save Form Layout box checked off, what it does is after you resequence your columns, it remembers that. So it's not something that you have to do every time you come back into the job. Okay. Other jobs or other check boxes here that are pretty handy, and of course is a little bit beyond halfway, is the checkbox for Apply Offsets on Save and Post. That's real significant because if you are a person that does data entry, rather than basically having to enter your credit offset to an invoice to accounts payable, or perhaps maybe you're entering a cash receipt and you've specified the revenue and you want the system to specify the cash account, this Apply Offsets on Save and Post does that for you automatically. Technically, what it does is there's a database that's maintained called Offsets, and for each type of transaction, whether it's an invoice or a check or a cash receipt or a journal entry, it's a predefined list that says if you put in this combination of fund and GL, this is the offset. So applying offsets on a Save and Post saves you time of having to do that manually on each and every transaction. That's probably the biggest one, in my opinion, biggest bang for your buck on this screen. Okay. Just below that, use the Enter key to move between fields. Okay. Certainly in a Windows environment, you can use your mouse to click from field to field or question to question. You can use your tab to go forward or Shift tab to go backwards. But if you're a quick data entry person, you like to use, let's say, your right hand on your numeric keypad, you can activate the Enter key to work much like a tab or much like a mouse click just by putting a check mark in that Use Enter key to move between fields boxes. So that's, I find that very handy. That's a little old-fashioned. I go back to the days of DOS, so I tend to like the Enter key. Okay. Other things maybe of significance here is when you look towards the bottom left, records per page, mine is defaulting to 500. What that does is if you can picture a grid, even if it's something like your vendors, the vendor is basically is going to load in so many records into the grid, and then you have your buttons at the top, which are the arrows that can jump from page to page or from the top or the bottom to your list. Well, this records per page, it's the default number of records that really identify how big a page is. So if you find you're hitting that jump to page, jump, you can force the system to load more records in screen by changing that value. Okay. If I were to jump over to the Alerts tab, okay, what I'd like to do, at a minimum, to be quite honest with you, is to have you check off at least the second and the third box on this screen, the confirm, the delete, and confirm and undo. Okay, so as we know, it's real easy to hit the delete key and away something goes. But the confirm delete gives you that kind of second shot at it, where it doesn't necessarily say, "Are you sure?" But that's basically what it's asking you. Okay. And likewise on the undo, same thing. Is undo is a button you click, and it's much like for those folks that work with Excel, and you hit the arrow so it takes you back a step. What the undo does here in MIP is it takes you back to your last save. Okay. So you might be working on a rec, and it's like, yuck, this is not what I want. Undo this. Let me start over. You hit the undo button, and if you have this checked off, you get confirmation. Just to make sure where we're deleting and undoing, it gives you 2 shots at it. Okay. Over to the Reports tab, okay. More or less what I like to do is just kind of focus on maybe the second and third checkoff box. Okay. If you're in an environment where you go into your reports and it's just, you pick a category and you just find that there's all kinds of reports listed, okay, you can pare down that list by basically putting a check mark in the second or the third checkbox here, which basically the second box says, only show me reports I created. I don't want to see everybody's reports in the system, but just mine. Okay. And then the third checkbox is when you kind of when you select a category of report, there's always default reports that get loaded with the system, and they're sometimes referred to as templates. And the way you know that they're default or templates is they've got the pointed brackets at the front and the back of the report name. Okay. Sometimes people like to hide those. So it's just, again, some basics, no great big bang for your buck here, but it's a way of cleaning up what you see in the drop list of your reports. Okay, and traveling over to the Colors tab. Okay, I strongly recommend to check off that highlight required fields box, and then by hitting the color button, it will show you a color palette. And what you want to do is stay away from the darker colors. Select some of the lighter colors. And as we know, what that does is when you're in a data entry screen and there's all kinds of questions, the fields that require a value will light up in this color so that you don't have to guess which ones are required. It's telling you which fields are required through the color coding scheme. And then below that, these additional color codes that you see, those deal with when you're in jobs like display vendor balances, maybe just plain old display balances. When you drill into transactions, you can drill down basically to 2 levels, and what it does is it uses different color coding just to help your eye read across the lines, and it's these colors are not bad. The light blue, the darker blue, they just basically, it looks good. It helps you differentiate one line for another. The screens tend to get a little busy. Okay, so that very quickly is some ideas with the customized workstation settings. Okay. Now from there, let's kind of traverse into a data entry screen And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just open up the Navigator panel on the left side, accounting, and come down to accounts payable. And, of course, we'll pick on the invoice screen to demonstrate a few principles. Okay. Now, one of them here is you can either do this at the session level, which is this is where we are right now, is all data entry screens start with a session panel. We're going to talk a little bit about entry defaults, which can be accessed, as you can see, by that single icon. We can either do it here at this level, or we can do it on the next screen. Okay, so let me go to the next screen just to give you an idea. So as we know, plus sign to get the system to assign us the next available session ID. Okay, batch to post. Description is not required, but I'm going to just put something in there. I like to recommend something if you're in a multi-user environment, especially important to put something in that field, even if it's as simple as your initials, so that you can later identify your session versus your coworkers. Okay. Oftentimes I'll get a question too about this date on the screen. Do you need to change that? Well, the original design of the software was this date represents really the calendar date that you're entering something into the system. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the invoice date or the journal entry date, but it's really for those folks that want to keep track of, hey, when did I do this, versus maybe the effective date of when something hits the general ledger. That's what this date is intended. Okay. However, as we know, when I hit the Start button, when we get to the next screen, which is the document screen on the upper half, once we start entering in some information, and I hit the tab, the date field populates. It literally populates from the session date, and the description populates from the session description. And those can be overwritten. And if it's not necessary to always keep track of when you're doing the work. A lot of people overwrite that date, and they make it what they call maybe their check issue, or in some fields they call it a warrant date. Okay. But what ends up happening is focusing on the entry default. Here's that little icon again, okay, kind of a squiggly page, if you will. And what that will do for us is these are predetermined fields in the software, okay? And what you can do is something like this, okay? I like this one in particular towards the bottom, the line effective date. And let me make that the last day of the month, okay? And I'm going to stay away from all these other fields just to demonstrate this one functionality. I'm going to say okay, okay? And just for argument's sake, I'm going to come up here and say, you know what, I have an invoice that came in on August 2nd. Okay, it was for $100. Okay, if I want, I could type this and say supplies. And by the way, that is the description that prints out on your AP check if the check is configured to include the description. We'll grab a vendor. Okay, and then I'm sure my combination of words and numbers are a little silly, but just to illustrate this point is once I select a fund number, notice way out to the right-hand side of this grid area, the effective date is 8/31. Okay, and again, remember what I did here on the entry defaults is I told it the effective date would be 8/31. Okay, so by changing that entry default, what it does is instead of carrying the invoice date, 8/2, down to the effective date, it allows me to select specifically when I want the general ledger to show this as an expense for $100 against this particular vendor. Okay, and again, that can be done. And what it does is it gets a little bit fussy in terms of when you can hit that. It either says finish your entry that you're working on or do it beforehand. But once you finish your entry, if you want to do it after the fact, after you put in your first entry, that's fine. Just complete your first entry and then set your entry default. Okay, and that can be based on any one of your segments. on the entry date. It can be based on line item descriptions, is what you see way out here on the right side of the grid. Okay, and it does save time. In particular, if you're entering a batch of bills for in this environment, maybe for a particular fund and grant combination, or maybe in your environment would be a fund or a division, sometimes called a department. Sometimes it's if you enter the defaults, it just saves you time as you're doing data entry. Okay, now let's do this. Even though we've got a $100 invoice, I'm going to basically say $25. I'm going to debit $25 to this account. Okay. Now, I left this message that just popped up. I left that intentionally in the software, just so that I wanted to talk about this briefly once I finish the entry. But this is basically just a warning. You'll notice embedded here in the messages, it's a warning, not a stop. And what it's basically saying is, wait a minute, you want me, the system, you've told me to tell you if anything is posted with an effective date after 12/31/20. Okay, and I just wanted to take a minute and show you where that's coming from. So I'm going to just say, okay, let it go. Okay, and I will come back to that in just a minute. And I do have additional fields in my grid for this database. But this is what I wanted to show you is, so we've got a $100 invoice at the top. We've got a debit for $25. Obviously, it's not, the $100 invoice isn't fully distributed. And what you can literally do on your keyboard to save some time is if you hit your F6 key, okay, what that does is F6, as you can see, just with that one keystroke, auto-dupe the whole line. Okay. Now, I might come back in here and say, okay, well, this is going to be charged off to maybe that account. Okay, I can come over here to the debit line and put in the remaining amount of the invoice. So essentially what it does is the F6, which duplicates the entire line, saves you some typing. Okay. On the other hand, in F5, rather than duplicating an entire line, let me demonstrate that. I'll come over to the fund field. And again, there's my warning that we'll get rid of here in a second. So where the F6 auto-dupe the entire line, and F5 will duplicate just the previous field above it. Okay. Some of these other fields are auto-duping because I have the entry default set. Okay. Basically, the entry default is set to bring in the effective date, and on the vendor ABC, I've associated account number 57 or GL number 57001. But you can always, out to the left-hand side of a line, and kind of, I call it the gutter, you can left-click that line and literally hit the delete key on the keyboard, and away it goes. Okay. Now, another thing here is we did look at in our workstation preferences, we set up so that the system would automatically make the offsets on a save. So again, we'll hit the save button. You saw something flash pretty quickly. If I go back up to the drop arrow at the invoice field and select our invoice, basically what happens is the system generated those two entries right there, which are offsets to the accounts payable account, so that we have a balanced entry, debits equal to credits. Okay, and that let me hit delete on those two for just a second. So that there's three different ways really you can force the offsets. One is on the save because of our workstation preferences. Another is at the top, that wavy flag there, the colored wavy flag. If I click on that, system will still manually make the offsets, but we see them, and then we hit save. So it's kind of like a two-stepper. Instead of just save generates the offsets, closes the entry, where the wavy flag generates the offsets, and we have to hit save. Okay, and then also what happens, of course, is you can always manually enter those offsets. Okay, so just again, probably more a refresher there of different functionality in the system. Okay, let me go ahead and hit save here. Okay. And let's do this. Let's start another entry, and I'm just obviously making up numbers here. Let's say we're going to pay something for $1, and let's say it's supplies. Okay, we'll get vendor rapid supplies. Okay. There's also oftentimes, too, whether they're custom fields that have been added to the screen, like in my environment here, this warrant number, it's basically a number. It's a user-defined field, and it's a field that basically is assigned to a group of invoices. Okay. Oftentimes, that field is off to the right. It's out of our view. Okay, and there's a way that can be populated with a default value, but it's significant enough in this the use of this field for the condition I'm thinking of. It's significant enough that I really want to see it. I don't want it necessarily to be hidden or how I have to scroll to the right to see it. And this is what I'm going to demonstrate here is applicable to any column in a grid. You can left-click it to highlight it. So I left-clicked to highlight it and let go. Then I'm going to come back and left-click it, and you'll notice just below the cursor, there's a little square box that means, yep, I got the field, I got it. Now I'm holding it down. I'm holding down my left mouse click, and I'm going to I can either move left or I can move right. In my instance, I'm going to go left. And there's a very light red arrow or red. Not an arrow, it's a line. It's a vertical line. And as I go to the left, as I move around, what it does is that red arrow indicates if I was to let go of the mouse clicker, that's where it's going to drop that field. Okay? So it's basically left click to get the field, let it go, come back, left click again, so you have that little square box underneath the cursor, and whether you move left or right, the arrow just gives you an idea of where it's going to drop that field. Okay, so it's the ability to resequence these columns to make your data entry more effective or how you would like to see it. And again, keep in mind under the workstation preference, because we have that first box, save form layout, we don't have to do this every time. The system's going to remember how we resequenced our columns. Okay. Now, here's an example of undo. On the lower right, when I hit undo, I basically get the more or less, are you sure? And it's, yep, undo that entry. Okay. It doesn't wipe out like with an Excel. It only goes back one field at a time. And undo here in MIP goes all the way back to my last save. So in essence, it wiped out that entire entry I was working on. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, when we were doing the data entry, we got that warning message about effective dates. Okay. That's actually coming here from organization and then organization preferences. And then there's a tab here for entry dates. Okay. And what you see here on this screen is each horizontal line represents a different transaction type in the MIP system, from invoices to credit memos to checks, all the way down to if you were using our sales entry order system. And really there's 4 dates, 4 different columns you see here, where you can either have really prohibits or hard stops versus warnings. And it's a front-end date and a back-end date, okay? And oftentimes what you'll see is people will set this at a minimum to their fiscal year so they confine the data entry to the current fiscal year, okay? There's also occasions where clients will set this up where a particular month might be reconciled, and what they want to do is lock it down to data entry so there's no accidental posting to a closed period. And these are toggles in the sense that you can turn them on, you can turn them off, so it's not like a hard stop, almost similar to closing a fiscal year, but it's really kind of like a turn it on, turn it off so that you can post or lock something to posting, get permission to reopen it for a particular reason and post into that period. But that's where our warning message was coming from. This was saying fiscal 20, and I'm going to, or calendar 2020. I'm going to jump it up to 2021 and just go ahead and save that. Okay, lots of information in a short period of time. Let me just talk to you about one other thing, or perhaps two things here, is under maintain, there's something called distribution codes in MIP, okay? And let me just call up the one that's general, okay? And these are names, they're user-defined names, and a distribution code can be applied to both, to either just your accounting, just to your payroll, or perhaps both, accounting and payroll, okay? And what they basically are is it's a predefined, if you will, allocation. So in this instance, what you can see is there's several GL strings here. And then we're using the percent field. The different percentages must add up to 100%. But essentially what it does for you here is, keep in mind we've got this general. And what do we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 accounts. Let me demonstrate to you what that will do here. I'm going to come back over here. Okay, let me just keep closing out of there so that we come back to invoice entry. We'll get a session number. Okay, violated my own rule and skipped the description because of time constraints. But it's basically what ends up happening is you fill in your document information. Okay, and what it will do is this, is when you get down here to the fund area, you can recall or use a distribution code. Okay, you can basically use the distribution code, which means you're calling up one that previously existed, or you can build on this icon over here. You can build it on the fly. But what happens is when you select use, okay, and you select your distribution code, okay, you can alter all the information that you see here in the blue, and because we're dealing with expenses, the distribution code is a debit as opposed to perhaps if we were doing a revenue on the credit side. When I say okay, what the distribution code does is it says, okay, your invoice is for 1,000, and based on that predefined allocation for built in that general distribution code, it took the 1,000, and as you can see, obviously it distributed out to these 8 or so accounts based on the distribution. What that does is obviously it saves you time in your data entry. Okay. The big question, of course, is that pertinent? Is that something that you would have? It could be things like electric bills, maybe rent that's based on square footage, or any situation where you might be able to take a lump sum and allocate it out to several different accounts. You can do that through the use of a distribution code. And again, it's not a requirement in the AP system. To be honest with you, it's a requirement in the payroll system. And you can certainly have a distribution code that says 100% goes to a single account. But it does save you time if you have a situation where you have allocations. A single bill is allocated out to many GL accounts. Okay, and let me go ahead and undo this entry. And because it was on the list, I do just want to mention this, okay, is if you are at an invoice field, invoice number in this instance, or if you were in a journal entry and it's the document or voucher number, there is an icon at the top of the page here to recall a memorized document, okay? And what ends up happening is MIP not only allows you to memorize an entry and recall it later, you can even set it up as reoccurring. So maybe it's something that happens monthly or quarterly or weekly. Memorizing is right now the icon to the left of the red calendar is the memorize. And what ends up happening is you fill in your screen, and before hitting save, you memorize it and give it a name. It can later be recalled using this recall button, and it says, okay, which one do you want? And let me grab the one that says electric. Okay. We can give it a document number, which essentially would be your invoice number. And let me go ahead and put just something different in there just to keep it unique. We can control the expense and the effective date. And what that essentially does is by recalling that memorized document, again, it will allocate it out based on the amount that we just saw or what the original entry looked like. And again, repeating entries, whether it's something that you want to control how often it repeats, or if you want to make it auto reoccurring, it's a way in the system to get invoices in and save you some time through the data entry. And I did just use the word invoice. Keep in mind it can apply to revenue, it can apply to journal entries, cash disbursement entries. It's throughout the system. It's available. Okay. So that's some ideas of different functionality in the system that hopefully you have a takeaway of maybe at least one thing here that would be new and helpful to your workday. But those are major half hours up, basically what we were looking to cover today. Did want to thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to me. It's my email address is Kathy with a K .Dwyer DWYER @Zobrio.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you want to send my way. And again, thank you for your time, and until next time, thank you again.